So thank you for coming to Can We Teach Creativity? I hope you've been inspired and provoked by some of the great discussions we've had in the Battle for the Classroom strand. And I'm looking forward to continuing the debate with the question, can we teach creativity? The great educational debate caricatured as yet another battle between progressives and traditionalists. Both sides believe their approach to education will do more to cultivate creative thinkers and citizens of the future. And it seems creativity is key to this debate. So on one side we have people saying creativity is not just nice to have, but an economic necessity. And the infamous and famous Ken Robinson has said creativity is the crucial skill of the 21st century. Proponents of knowledge-led education argue that you need to know what's inside the box first. You need to understand an academic discipline before you can start to question and innovate in that discipline. Whereas the progressives argue that an increasingly academic curriculum means that schools are ignoring pupils' hidden creative talents. But that's a caricature, and if you've learned anything from the debates here at the Battle of Ideas, we have a range of nuanced speakers who are much more sophisticated than my caricature can offer to tackle questions such as what is true creativity and how should schools cultivate it? Are schools doomed to kill creativity or can they teach it? Is creativity a unique skill or simply the result of hard work and knowing your stuff? Can it be found outside of the arts, in science, technology or business? Do we know how to encourage creativity or even what it is? So, to kickstart the debate, we have a star-studded panel of creative brains who will each have between 4 and 6 minutes to put across their opinions on the topic, after which, as I'm sure you now understand, it will be your turn to contribute to the debate. Apparently, a certain Tom Bennett on Twitter, infamous on ResearchEd, has argued that there's no debate to be had on this topic, so I think it's our collective responsibility to prove him wrong and have a real debate. So, let me introduce the speakers in the order which they'll be speaking. First, we have Martin Robinson on the far right. He's an educational consultant and teacher. He's also author of the best-selling book Trivium 21C, Preparing Young People for the Future with Lessons from the Past, and he writes for the Times Educational Supplement. Secondly, we have JJ Charlesworth, an art critic and writer. JJ contributes to a range of magazines on contemporary art, such as Art Monthly, Modern Painters, and Time Out, and is senior editor of ArtReview. Thirdly, we have Nick Corston, co-founder of STEAM Co, set up to power communities to inspire children with creativity across the STEAM skills of science, tech, engineering, arts, and maths. Then we have Sean Gregory, who is an experienced leader of creative development across the arts. He's currently director of creative learning for the Barbican and the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, and was previously head of the Centre for Creative and Professional Practice at the Guildhall School. He's also one of the key partners who made the Battle of Ideas come to the Barbican, so we need to really thank him for this whole festival and how it's happening. And last but not least, we have Annie Warburton, who is creative director of the Crafts Council and was previously head of partnership at Creative Skillset, the Skills Council for Creative Industry. She's written widely on topics of craft and design, creative education, innovation, and the creative economy. So without further ado, let me hand over to Martin to kick us off.
I was just looking at this question, can we teach creativity? And I think I could answer yes or no and be equally convinced that I was arguing the right thing. So I'm going to toss a coin. Heads, it's no. Tails, it's yes. Heads it is. So no, you can't teach creativity. And I think you mentioned Ken Robinson. And I think we do have to start with Ken Robinson, who is no relation of mine. No relation of mine. So I have no interest particularly in the Robinson clan here. But he wants to develop a creative mindset in children. And I think that is hugely problematic. It's not about creativity per se, it's about a creative mindset. And I think that's one of the first things we need to point out. In one of his speeches at the RSA, he quotes Abraham Lincoln saying, "We must think anew and act anew and disenthrall ourselves from the past." And that's another problem to me. Robinson wants to disenthrall ourselves from the old way of doing things, including the way schools do things and the way schools look. He wants personalisation. He wants to make schools fit the children they teach. And that leads to technology being part of the answer. Now, all those things to me are problematic. He also talks about creative industries and the success of the economy with creativity. And that is problematic. For a start, creative industry sounds, I don't think it is, but it sounds a bit oxymoronic. And good for the economy, I think creativity should be bad for the economy. And I think that would release us from the problems that we find ourselves in this sort of ersatz X-factor idea of what creativity is. All beanbags and colourful prime colours, you know, in rooms and project work and all these things, which is not what creativity is. Creativity doesn't look like that at all. In fact, a lot of the time, creativity is a very dusty attic with a lone person in there scrawling away with a quill, or an artist, you know, scrawling away, or indeed in some poor, I suppose, basement somewhere, a group of people in black leotards trying to put together a bit of mime. So all these things, you know, it's not anything like Ken Robinson does, and it's nothing to do with anything on the west coast of America. If we cut off California out of the argument, that would help us a lot as well. Because if we're going to teach creativity, we need the tradition. We need the past. We can't disenthrall ourselves from it. We need to teach ideas around beauty, aesthetics, taste, good taste and bad taste. We need discrimination. We need children to develop a palate and subjectivity, not objectivity. We have to embrace in assessment the fact that we can't be objective about things, that we could be completely subjective, but, of course, with the tradition guiding us. And this is what we need to do. We need to teach children the tradition, the discipline, the way things are done around here in this subject area. And that's how we can harness the idea of teaching creativity. Creativity comes from the art, the tradition. It is then questioned. It questions, it finds its way into saying, well, what about this? What about this? And it looks at different ways of challenging it, whether it be with the urinal or whatever it happens to be. And then it passes it on. And then it passes it on. So it's the tradition that is creative, not the disenthralling ourselves from it. And I think, to me, that is the most important thing. Why we can't teach creative mindset, we can teach creativity in subjects. Thank you.
Okay, and keeping within time, I think you've done a great job of trying to smash Ken Robinson down from his pedestal. Perhaps some other panellists would like to build him up again. JD.
Yeah, I can't say I follow Ken Robinson too much, but I can see why he raises hackles. But anyway, can we teach creativity? Initial answer to that question, and I think it's something we're going to bounce around a lot, comes back to a quite simple and fundamental issue as to whether we think creativity is an innate human capacity and what we mean by that. Innateness is a key idea. The idea that everyone within them has this fundamental potential to be creative. Creativity is a sort of wellspring capacity that everyone has by virtue of being human. Creativity, if you break it down, if you just hack away at it in the dictionary, turns out to be the state of being that which brings things into being. Right? If you do the suffixes and all that stuff, I'm not very good at. Anyway, now much of the common sense way of thinking about this term puts a lot of store on the opposition between this sort of nebulous and slightly fluffy idea of spontaneous, innate creativity on one hand, and then the evil, bad constraints put upon that spontaneity by mostly society. Historically, at least in the field of modern art, the polarity between creativity and constraint was played out around the problem of the academy as a constraint on the individual. And that's the background which feeds our general appreciation of creativity as an emblem of personal freedom and personal self-realization. It's always been a big deal since modernism that the academy is the thing that you've got to break out of because you want to be free. In the time since I began a degree in fine art, which is now going on for 22 years, back in the mid-90s, the word creative and creativity have become a kind of voodoo, a mysterious, almost magical term in which the hopes and aspirations of politicians and policy wonks and economists have been condensed and refracted. So for me, the idea of creativity, while I attach great value and great hope to it, has to be treated with a great deal of care, since as an idea, creativity has become instrumentalized by those who would use it as a way to avoid some bigger questions, principally about the economy and another question around making things, bringing things into being, which is productivity. Now, we produce a great many creatives. Creative Art and Design subject group, if you look at undergraduate statistics, is the second largest in undergraduate admissions, after another group, which is Business and Administration Studies. If you break it down, graphic designers are the second largest single subject chosen at undergraduate level, just behind law studies. So out of almost the 500,000 students who start degrees each year, 10%, in other words, are those studying creative arts and design subjects. In 1997, when I finished my studies, the proportion of undergraduates studying those subjects was only 7% of the intake, a cohort which itself was much smaller, if you remember, you might not remember. But the last 20 years have seen a rise in undergraduates from around 300,000 to, as I say, just under 500,000. Much of that rise in that subject area can be put down to the direct and indirect promotion of the creative sector as something which is this kind of a great hope for the economy. So we have no problem teaching creatives through our university system. I'm not so familiar with how it's working at primary school or secondary school level, but regardless of any complaints about the primary and secondary sector, we're doing very well when it comes to it in degree level. And some might argue, of course, that we are creating too many creatives. So the Warwick Commission report, which came out, I think, earlier this year, which the blurb refers to, makes some familiar arguments, for example, about the economic value of the creative sector, but it also has to admit that there is a problem of employability of creatives, not so much to do with unemployment, but to do with a large supply of creatives to the creative job market, a high supply which is reflected by low pay and precarious employment terms. The Warwick report is not unusual in wanting to talk in one breath of the cultural and creative industries. This is a new form of policymakers' code language which has emerged. It's evolved in the last 10 years or so in order to justify the subsidised cultural sector's continued right to receive public subsidy. So by and large, politicians and policymakers, even though they like the idea of creativity, have abandoned the idea that culture and creative culture should receive public subsidy for its intrinsic merits as art. So the argument has shifted to the idea that there's a sort of ecosystem synergy between the unprofitable creative sector and the profitable one. The presence of one is supposed to sustain the other, is the current argument. Now, one of the classical distinctions in the arts, stretching back, I think, to the mid-19th century and certainly in Britain to the Great Exhibition, is that between the fine and the decorative or industrial arts. The Victorians were at least straight in making this distinction. Creativity could be applied to manufacture and led to the shift in terminology from decorative to applied arts to industrial arts. And this was followed in the 20th century with a huge influence of things like the Bauhaus and the idea that creativity could be put to service of making better products to make life better. Fine arts have had a slightly more problematic relationship, certainly to elite patronage. But nevertheless, the underlying assumption that some art was unproductive and part of leisure, and other arts could be part of the world of work and production, is a strong distinction. Now, just to try and quickly conclude that point into a point of argument, what's interesting now is that we have a very blurred understanding of the economic and productive aspect of creativity, as opposed, and that of leisured creativity or leisure, creative and artistic work which is done for its own sake. My kind of logic for that is simply that as we've shifted to the service sector, there's an increased demand for creativity in the world of service sector work. Now, the only problem I really have, and this is what I really want to debate here, is that service sector work has fetishized, or the idea of creativity in the service sector has fetishized the idea of the arts, the fine arts and the free arts, the arts of leisure, as the thing that creativity should look like, even in the world of economic activity. So my real beef with this is not so much that creativity is something you can teach or not teach, but that at the moment we mix up the idea that this old notion of the arts, which was the leisured fine arts has become the totem for an idea of creativity which is not being properly addressed in the whole of certainly commercial and economic life. We don't actually talk about creativity for what it is in the abstract, regardless of what form it takes and in which situation. So that's really the thing I want to try and work through this evening.
Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting to think about schools, whether we want this useful or a useless kind of creativity, and what the purpose for creativity. And I think the point you made about having too many creatives is not one that we're hearing at all. Nick, thank you.
I think I'll probably return to the question, which is very much, can we teach creativity? I'm just a dad, so you're not going to get an academic definition of creativity or necessarily its role in society. And I should jolly well hope that we can teach creativity, otherwise a lot of art colleges are going to go out of business tomorrow, and there's been a big thing in the paper today, they're looking to close the cast down now. I think we'll move it up to Holloway Road or whatever, so there's a big lot of fuss going on about that. I think to actually flip it on its head, for me, I think it's about, can we just stop teaching creativity out of children? And that's one of the themes of Ken Robinson's talk. Anybody probably knows the Picasso line, we're all born creative and we have it taught out of us. And Sugata Micho, in his talks, he says, you know, when we rolled the British Empire out, we didn't need creativity. We wanted conformity, we wanted standardization, traditionalism reinforces that. So let's not teach that. For me, it's much more important to nurture it before we lose it. I was in a school in Cambridge yesterday, one of our pop-up STEAMco days at a super little school, the Spinney School in Cambridge, and at the end of the afternoon we'd run a bunch of activities, and a lady came up to me, a Muslim lady came up with her little child who's 5, and she said, I just want to thank you, my daughter came up with an invention today. She designed a gadget, an invention. I didn't know she had it in her. She'd never done anything like that before. And that little girl had sat in a classroom there, watching a film that we'd put together by a young designer inventor called Dominic Wilcox. He let us use his books. We printed out a load of sheets that were spread around the classroom. These children were being inspired by one of the world's greatest creatives. He was on the Late Show the other week in a classroom in a school in Cambridge. He was nowhere near. He was down in London. And I think if we can nurture this creativity by scaling the fantastic creative geniuses we have in this country, we can not only nurture it, we can inspire creativity. Quite easily, it's not rocket science. It's about taking what happens on the South Bank. It's about taking what happens in some of our galleries, some of our institutions, some of our higher and secondary education institutions, and taking that into the community, taking it into primary schools, which is what we're trying to do with STEAMco. Another hackneyed phrase, it takes a whole village to raise a child. You know, that the ability is latent in our community, and Robert Winston at a conference a couple of years ago banged his fist on the table and said, we've got to get kids in primary, we've got to nurture, sow the seed of inspiration. Guy Claxton, lovely phrase, we've got to help children understand what they want to be good at and help them pursue that dream as a group. But primary teachers are flat out teaching kids to read, write and do maths against government targets. My son's going into year 6. He's got a year of SATs tests coming up. He's not going to learn an awful lot more. He's just training, teaching for the test. And we have it in us to go into primary schools with projects like STEAMco and other ventures. Chatting to Craft Council earlier, they're doing projects, fantastic work to get creativity going and to create connections with primary schools. And we can do this, we can connect. And Dominic Wilcox is one example of how we can tap into famous world-class creatives from around the UK, package them up and take them into schools, not just some token gesture photo for the paper, but do it once, package it up. 15,000 primary schools in this country can be inspired. So for me, it's, yes, we can teach it. Let's not teach it out while we've got a chance. Let's not teach creativity out of that 5-year-old child. Let's nurture it. Let's inspire it. Let's take it further as a group, and let's all get involved. So that's really my pitch. And creativity, as I said, I'm not going to start defining it now. Creative thinking, doing, painting, drawing, dancing, whatever form it takes. Art itself is a very contentious phrase, and there's a fantastic, everybody's talked today about Ken Robinson and other figures, Sugata. I'd draw your attention to the works of Seth Godin in this space as well. He wrote a fantastic white paper called Stop Stealing Dreams. If that doesn't sum up what we're doing to a lot of our children, I don't know what does. And Seth Godin, in one of his talks, says art is what we call it when what we do might connect people. We're in a society, we're a community. Let's come together for the sake of our children. Let's give them a more fulfilling life, and let's maybe make creativity just a small part of that.
Okay, thank you, Sean.
Thank you very much. So my stance on this is that you cannot teach creativity, but you can provide the environment and alongside that teach the tools to give you the approaches to build skills, but also to develop your creative capacity as well. What do I mean by that? I think creativity is as much a process as well as an outcome and an output. And the learning that goes with that and the teaching that goes alongside them are both critical. It's a human, personal and interpersonal experience. It contributes to our life skills, whatever we end up doing, as well as potentially to you producing a great new invention or a great piece of art in your own right. With that comes craft. Craft and creativity should go in hand right from the start. You can teach craft. You can teach the skills, whether it's through core subjects in the school classroom or skills related to a particular art form of learning an instrument or drawing, painting, whatever. And through that, you start to find your own creative voice. But your creative voice becomes through your own personal response, and that personal response is to do with the environment you're in and potentially the environment that has been created by the school itself. You therefore start to unlock your creativity. I think that's the point where you start to get a sense of what your innate sense of creativity is. Without going too far into whether we're all creative or not, we all have a voice, we all have something to say, and again, without getting too humanistic at this stage about it, I think the role creativity and the creative process and experience plays within that is crucial to the development of a human being and to society at large. Creativity is also there to reject things. So having talked about craft and creativity, the history, the past, absolutely right, it's about the past and the present together. What you can create now in response to what was there before and what could be in the future is critical. But part of that process is to reject. I don't think you teach people how to reject. Dare I say, you don't encourage people to reject things, particularly within a school environment. But you can, again, create the environment to test assumptions, to ask children and young people, teachers themselves, to reflect on things and to critically decide for yourself, individually or together, what something is or what something could be. Creativities and ways into it are there for everyone. Schools approach things in the way they teach so that everyone can access it, everyone could be part of it, and where necessary you adjust your approach to suit that young person, that group of people. Creativity, I feel, is the same thing. We have a responsibility, I think, collectively, not just through schools and through teachers themselves, to provide creative environments for young people, children and young people to thrive. So I do feel I'm on dangerous ground by saying you can't teach it, because maybe by saying you can't teach it, you're immediately negating it and putting it yet further back, as we are so obsessed almost at the moment by what skills are you taking into the real world. But I think those two things do count together. So in order to address that, as I say, it's beyond schools, it's about the partnership working. I'm sorry to use that overused term at the moment, but the way that schools, families and parents, cultural organisations such as the Barbican, higher education institutions, local community groups, local authorities work together, again, to create the right framework, the right environment to ensure every young person, every school has access to good cultural education, i.e. experiencing art, I'm talking as a musician, as an artist of the highest order, and then also providing the opportunity for you to make and get yourself involved with it as well. And those two things, again, must not be separated, I feel. So just to very quickly sum up, it does worry me that, from my perception, creativity is being squeezed out of schools. I think it's less about whether creativity is in the curriculum itself and more about where does creativity and the environment of creativity sit within a school? How does that exist? How can pupils, young people, teachers together have that experience and that joy of doing things together? It's not something to follow after a certain point of skinning yourselves up. That's another thing that concerns me as well, this idea that you need to have learnt so much on a musical instrument or so much in writing before you can start to create. Again, those things, as you learn to speak, as you learn to write as a child, I speak as a father as well, you start to create your own stories and your own pictures. And why we can't sort of make that connection in terms of other things as well, I don't know. We sometimes seem to fall into this thing of, that's that, but then in other things, you have to do one thing first before you can actually start to create. Creativity is serious. I think this is another thing. It's something, it's a form of play. It is play. It's a chance to play, to take risks, to reject things, as I said earlier, if you want to, in an informed way based on the experience you're having. People like Grace and Perry and Eames, we're about to open a big exhibition here, so I had to put one pitch in. They talk about playing seriously, about serious play. Creativity is classless. This is one of the very final points I wanted to make. Of course, we talk about what people have access to, what they don't, the privileged, the underprivileged, the overserved, the underserved. Creativity is something for everyone to explore. It starts with a resource that we all have, ourselves. What's inside us, the context we're in, the people we're with, and then we begin to explore how we want to express that individually and collectively. I would argue that teachers do that pretty much every day in their school, whatever curriculum they're working to, so we should not forget that, however we choose to frame creativity.
Thank you for broadening the definition a little bit, Annie.
Okay, thank you. Creativity is part of human nature. It can only be untaught. That's a statement by the dissident artist and current Royal Academy poster boy, Ai Weiwei. We heard earlier from Picasso. I think Picasso said something along the lines of all artists borrow, great artists thieve. I think Ai Weiwei stole that idea from Picasso. Now, like all the best aphorisms, that one is both provocative and it can be read in many, many ways. I'm using it as a starting point and I'll talk about how I'm reading it, because I agree and disagree with that statement. I do agree that creativity is a human trait. It is something innate in all of us. However, we don't all have it to the same degree, and we don't all have it in the same way. So there are differences of degree and kind. There are many different kinds of creativity. There are many creativities, musical, visual, mathematical, scientific, and so on. I also agree with Ai that creativity can be untaught. And I think we're in a great era of unteaching in the way that both the school and university education systems are operating in this country. The financial incentives and the performance measures are both driving a lot of unteaching of creativity. But I disagree with Ai that it can only be untaught. In other words, as a human capacity, I think that creativity, just like sporting ability, like a sense of rhythm, can be stimulated, it can be channeled, and crucially, it can be practiced. We can think of a creative breakthrough as a kind of accident. It's where someone's skills, aptitudes, interests, knowledge all come together and create the conditions for that flash of inspiration, that spark of innovation. But those accidents, those creative accidents, don't happen to us all. Some of us are more accident-prone than others. So that's the difference of degree. But also, you're only going to have a creative accident in a subject, an area, a domain in which you're highly skilled, in which you're highly practiced. I'm never going to have a creative accident in composing contemporary music because I'm unpracticed in it, right? But if we think about that as what creativity might be, just as a lens to look at it, then if a creative breakthrough is a kind of accident, then a creative training helps us all become more accident-prone in our chosen domain. So if that's the case, then how can creativity be taught? Well, I don't think teaching is the right word here. I think training is a much better word. We need to stimulate wonder, curiosity. We need to facilitate collaboration. We need to build confidence to take risks. And also, we need to encourage purposeful practice. And training, teaching, creativity entails a really fine balance between encouragement and provocation. It's also about ensuring that there's material to work with. And by material, I mean knowledge, I mean skills, I mean a knowledge of the past and tradition. If you look at John Coltrane's amazing improvisations or the creativity of Alexander McQueen, Both are predicated on a deep, practiced knowledge of their art form. McQueen famously trained at Gives and Hawkes as an apprentice on Savile Row. And it was that subjection to the discipline, the constraints, if I'll pick up JJ's point, I think constraints are crucial to creativity. So McQueen trained, and then he went on to St Martin's and trained further. And it was that balance of really knowing his skill and practice and creative thinking that unleashed his fierce talent. The starting point, or one of the starting points for this debate, was the Warwick Commission report. It noted a sharp decline in GCSE entries in art subjects, and the most startling statistic that it produced, which was actually derived from earlier Crafts Council research, was that the number of students entering for GCSE design and technology fell by 50% over a 10-year period. And this is a subject that leads to the Thomas Heatherwicks, the Johnny Ives, the Barbara Osgobys of the world. So that's important. Arts education is important, but I think we need to unshackle this debate from unshackle teaching creativity or training in creativity and arts education, because they're two different questions, related but different. And they're both important, and they're both suffering from neglect at the moment. I would say that in arts education, there's more opportunity in general to facilitate those creative aptitudes, play we heard about, experimentation, risk-taking, and the ability to make and recover from mistakes. But creativity isn't the sole preserve of the arts. I don't know about you, but I've definitely had teachers in subjects like geography who were far more creative than those in subjects like art, and vice versa, of course. But creativity is an aptitude that cuts across all human endeavour. If we say it can't be taught, then we're subscribing to a notion of the soul genius, of the sort of Blakean hand of God, bestowing creativity on the individual. But there's a much more mundane truth, is that it's in us all to a greater or lesser extent. And we can hone it, we can exercise it, or we can leave it flabby and undeveloped. So it can be taught or trained, and I think it ought to be, and that's a matter, there's an economic imperative, yes, but I don't think that's the main driver at all. It's a matter of social justice, and it's a matter of who we are as humans. That creativity is one way through which we express ourselves, through which we derive a sense of meaning, of purposefulness, and create the sense of a life well lived, the eudaimonic well-being that Aristotle talked about. So it's crucial that we teach it. And I'm going to just add one tiny last thing, which is we talk a lot about reading, writing, and arithmetic, the 3 R's. But when the 3 R's were first introduced in Parliament, it was a different 3 R's. It was reading, wroughting, and arithmetic. In other words, wroughting, making things. And creativity, whether it's conceptual or whether it's producing, you're making connections. We're always making things. So I'll leave you with that.
Okay. I will try and give the audience as much of a chance as possible to give their opinions. But first, I'd like to give the panel a chance to respond to each other. I think we've had some really interesting contradictions. So we have on one side people saying that there's not enough people doing GCSEs in art, and on the other side we have too many creatives coming out of arts college. And then there's the idea of creativity for what purpose? Is it for the economy? Is it for life skills? Is it for self-actualization? So I think. And then there's the idea of whose responsibility is it to foster creativity? So would anyone like to come back on a different panellist?
I think one thing that's already emerged in these opening remarks is, can we clarify whether we mean that this thing called creativity, which is the sort of sprite or, pixie, is actually located, is this genie in the arts bottle, right? And if it's not, then why should we concentrate on the arts as if it were the embodiment of this idea of creativity? Now, I think that's an important issue, because if it means that education is compartmentalized with this kind of misunderstanding or this error fundamental to it, then we're not really asking the question, well, how is the creative capacity of people nurtured and developed in all areas of both the curriculum and then, undergraduate study and so on, and postgraduate, and from there on in. So that, I think, it needs to be thrashed out. I think that this issue of the innateness, the innate is not a genetic trait, right? Creativity, right? It's not actually like being a sports person, where effectively your genes is going to a large part, dictate how good you can be at something. There is no gene for creativity. I don't think, I'm not a geneticist, and I don't know if someone's hunting for it, but I think it would be a stupid idea. And the reason I think it's not is because I think creativity is it comes out something which isn't in the body of the individual. It comes out society. It's society that gathers together and builds a knowledge that people can then further and create more from, right? My daughter, she's really good at drawing, yeah? But she's only really good at drawing because my wife and I are really interested in drawing, and we do a lot of drawing with her. And so she's learned something that's taken thousands of years for human beings to develop, which is representation. Right? And she's learnt it at the age of 3 because human culture has survived long enough and maintained this culture of drawing and the concept of representation throughout the centuries. And let's make no mistake, learning can be unlearned at a social level. Right? So the shift from Greco-Roman art, which is a high point of representation, back into the Dark Ages and Byzantine art, right, shows a regression of the capacity to picture and represent. So that's an example of the fact that when we talk about creativity, and we have this kind of slightly odd kind of cartoon opposition between spontaneity and wellspring, which is this abstract potentiality thing, and then constraint, the bad, evil society that wants to lock you down, a kind of 19th century sort of drama. I think we need to kind of be a bit careful about that thing, because really the inchoate, abstract thing of potentiality of creativity is always enacted in a form of discipline or a form of culture. It's not constraint, I don't think, in fact. When we talk, I think, about discipline, it's simply the aggregation, the accumulation of what has been learned. And into that, hopefully, we can do something which is creative. And I think that's where we need to try and define a little bit more what the creative at the moment in which it intervenes on what we already know is it in reality. I mean, and to point about the GCSEs and the Warwick Commission. I mean, unfortunately, whether GCSEs in the creative subjects are declining still isn't stopping students moving into creative art design subjects in increasing numbers, even after the fees increase a few years ago. So I think that we need to kind of work out why it is that people are still kind of communing in that kind of subject area and what it means for them to do so. Because, when it comes down to it, you can be a creative engineer, but we're training barely any engineers at that level.
Okay, anyone else want to come back?
I'm interested in a couple of things you're saying. First of all, I'd say constraints are very important, and I think constraints are in the discipline of the subject. And I think we have agreement on that, quite a few of us, I think. I'm also interested, you mentioned your daughter and teaching her. We talked about Johnny Ive earlier. Johnny Ive, his father was the HMI, the first HMI in this country for design and technology. So Johnny Ive, his upbringing was from a very early age in design and technology, so you can teach it in that way. You can teach the subject of design and technology and make people damn good at it. But that's not teaching creativity. That's teaching a subject that happens to have at its core a great deal of creativity. And I think that's slightly different. I'm also interested in this thing about zeitgeist. You're talking about the times in which we are. And I've got a few things. I'm going to read this out. This is from Murray, and it's per capita measures of fundamental discovery in the Western world, so Europe and North America. So it states, the golden age of the visual arts was between the mid-1400s and mid-1500s, with a second peak in the mid-1600s. Music creation peaks in the early 1700s, sustains a moderate high through to the middle of the 1800s. Western literature peaks in the early 1600s and again in the middle of the Victorian age, the 1850s and beyond. Scientific creativity peaks in the later 1600s and then again for a remarkable period from the mid-1700s to the late 1800s. And then we get to maths, and I was thinking things like the film arts, the 50s to the 40s to 50s, technology advances from the 20s to the 50s, so we've got all this thing. The past is a very creative time, and education in the past was very creative, and whether it be working in the apprentice or working in schools or whatever it happens to be, we have a very successful history of creativity and being creative in this country. And in other Western countries. If anything, part of the Western tradition, if anything, right at its core, is a very creative way of teaching. And teaching is not the problem. Education's not the problem. If anything, it's the Philistine culture that we've got around us that is not recognising what creativity is. And creativity should not be anything to do with creative industries and anything like that. It should not be anything to do with the economy. What creativity is something of itself in a subject which happens to be of interest to individuals and groups of individuals in the moment, in a moment of time. And that is where it's a wonderful thing to be involved in. But I don't think it can be untaught. I don't think it can be in any way. I don't think it's about training or teaching and all those sorts of things. If anything, good teaching has always helped creative thought and creative work. And you become creative when you make something. And when you produce something, that is the moment of creativity. You don't become creative before that. Only when you've had the opportunity to make something that is then worthwhile, that has worth to it, that is the moment that you become creative. So the more chances you have to write an essay that doesn't have to obey assessment objectives, but is actually a thoughtful essay that you put together, that's a creative thing. When you've actually work on a work of art that doesn't satisfy exam criteria, but it actually comes from the tradition of a subject, etc., etc. So all these things, if we had a better look at creativity as releasing at the end from a discipline at the beginning, I think that would help a lot.
Okay, I know that some other panellists are keen to quickly come back. I'm going to come out to the audience very soon. Do you want to quickly?
No, I was just intrigued actually of these peaks of various bursts of creative activity in the arts, painting, literature, science, whatever. Obviously, it wasn't endemic across society. There was a small pocket of people at the Royal Academy of something or other being taught in these arts.
Per head of population. So this is saying these are the most creative times per head of population. So more people have been creative at that time than any other particular time. It's not saying there are millions more now probably because there's more people. But per head of population, it was a high. I might have thought at the same time that 95% of the population were out in fields digging potatoes and doing whatever they were doing in those sort of darker eras, and coal mining and working pretty damn hard and living pretty frugal lives. And I always remember, to show my age now, How Green Is My Valley, a drama series in the sort of darkened times. And it really was quite an austere education process that those people were dragged through. And I almost fear as if we're dragging our children, dragging our schools back to an era like that, where an opportunity to express, to be creative, to live a creative life, as the Royal Society of Arts say in their Power to Create agenda. And I wonder if we're in danger of taking this back to a preserve of a very few, and at the expense of very many, basically, and the lives that they could be living.
Any comments from the other panellists?
I was very interested in the training in creativity, the education. I think this whole thing around, whether it's talking about teachers specifically, giving them the confidence to facilitate creativity, I think that's extremely important. I think, is this the arts bottle only? I think that's an important question. I don't think it is. I think creativity does need to permeate schools, which is why I was asking that question, should we be trying to put it in the curriculum, or is it something more about the environment and the context of a school and how the ethos of the school, whatever you want to call it. And the other thing about looking back and those peaks of creativity, I think then you're playing into this 21st century, the Warwick Commission itself and other publications recently, which are all about, we don't know what the future holds. Of course we don't, but what is being acknowledged is the rate of change. Everything's accelerating. Technology is playing a big part of that. So we don't know the skills that are going to be needed in 10, 15, 20 years' time. We could probably name some. But this is the perennial question in terms of what are we actually training and preparing children and young people for in the future. And that's not just to do with arts and the crafts and the performing arts, etc. That is to do with life in general.
Okay. I'm going to pick up on the question of student numbers in undergraduate and graduate courses remaining buoyant despite the GCSEs declining. What we're seeing is increasing numbers of overseas students. So the pipeline of domestic students is thinning, and the UK higher education is a huge export for the country as a whole, and not least creative education. So I think that I think actually that's in many ways a really good thing, because those different voices and different cultures and different perspectives are one of the things that fuel creativity, especially in this city. But I also think it's interesting that if we look at traditional essay-based subjects, like the one I did, philosophy, but geography, history, the humanities, we don't get concerned that people aren't going on after graduating and they're not becoming professional historians, professional geographers, professional philosophers. But we do seem to have that hang-up stroke expectation of that from people studying creative subjects. So we're still hanging on to studying a creative subject as a vocational training, whereas we might look at it as a training through art or through an artistic discipline that one could take into many, many different fields. I don't know, I'm just asking that question. I also want to pick up on something we haven't touched on at all, which is empathy and the moral imagination. I think the more that creative education has been instrumentalised, and I think that happens at both school and university levels, the less we think about what it means for us as humans. And actually the arts and cultural education, in its broadest sense, is a field in which we can and do develop empathy and develop moral imagination. I think we shouldn't ignore that. And the last point I want to make is just to pick up on Plymouth School of Creative Arts, which is a new school. It's been going 3 years. It's an all the way through school from reception through to 16, and it's connected to Plymouth College of Arts, so you can in fact go on into undergraduate and postgraduate education through that stream. And they are running in one of the most economically deprived wards in the country, and definitely in that city. And their vision is to teach every subject through a creative lens, and specifically a creative artistic lens. They've only just got going, so we'll see how it goes.
Okay, thanks.
Are there too many creatives? I'm creative, I draw a lot. Those drawings go in sketchbooks. When I fill those sketchbooks up, those sketchbooks get put in boxes, and those boxes take up space in my home. My wife wishes I was less creative, so there is one too many creative here. On the question, I agree with a lot of what Annie said about creative accidents. I've got a slightly different take on it. Creativity seems really simple to me. You can tell me if I'm being too reductionist. It's not a spontaneous creation of something out of nothing. It's more often not taking two or more existing things and putting them together in a new way. And that can be a banal, commonplace combination, or it can be an interesting, novel combination. Children are very creative, but they don't produce very much that's of interest to anybody except their parents and teachers. And it's not taught out of them. They, at some point, they realise that they need the skill to be able to express whatever they're trying to express. And we're not teaching that to those skills to them with enough urgency. They get downhearted and they give up. So I think creativity needs to be fed and it needs to be developed.
I just want to say, I think, yes, undoubtedly all children are very creative and we could do more to encourage this. But I think we need to look at kind of what happens to kids when they're 15, 16 and all of a sudden they're told to pick 3 A-level subjects. And I think, well, at my school anyway, there was a worry that if you decided to go and do photography or art or drama, how would you make a living? How are you going to pay your rent, I think? And so it encouraged so many people to kind of, go and do business studies or history because those are seen as proper, solid subjects where you can get a good degree at a good university. Obviously, the system, having to pick 3 subjects or 4 subjects makes it very hard to kind of be exploratory and do the creative things. One of you also mentioned that creativity is classless. Well, of course it is, yes. But then we've got to look at the kids from the kind of working class backgrounds who don't have that cultural capital and the economic capital to say, hey, I'm going to go and study art at university and I'm going to wing it because my parents are going to help me out, whatever, and I'm going to go to RADA and I'm going to be an artist. And I think there's a lot of kids from perhaps more working class backgrounds that don't have the confidence to go and do that.
Hi. Yeah, this was just following on from something that Martin said and Annie around creativity not just being about the arts per se, and I know the subject is about the arts and the Warwick Commission. However, I think I prefer to see us looking to creativity as more of the Renaissance man, creativity across all of the sciences and the arts, and trying to invoke that in children. And I think that possibly the way that we do that is we don't try and, or perhaps the question shouldn't be, can we teach creativity? Perhaps the question should be, can we teach children the desire to learn? And if you can teach them the desire to learn and question more, then I guess that's where the creativity will come from.
Hi. I think one way of looking at this, which might be a bit controversial, is to say that the emphasis on creativity is in opposition to actually teaching subject knowledge powerfully and deliberately. And so at the moment that the government has really tried to put knowledge back on the agenda in schools is exactly the moment that the creatives, or those that purport to support creativity, say, hold on a minute, you're going to sort of destroy children by teaching them. So I'd really like to see how the panel respond to that, because I think that actually if you do teach subjects properly, that's the moment which they then can contribute and, as in the ways that people have already said, actually become creative.
Okay, well, let's take one more, and then I'm going to give each panellist about 1 minute to pick something to respond to, and then we'll have another round, and then we'll have to do closing remarks.
I've noticed that a lot of the discussion has actually been not so much about can we teach creativity, but should we teach creativity, which I think's like perfectly fine. That's an interesting debate too. But what I'm interested in is that when we're talking about should we teach creativity, we tend to then try and relate it to economic benefits of creativity, rather than potentially the intrinsic qualities of creativity that people like Constant Nieuwenhuis in his New Babylon project, or that built on the work of Johann Huizinga, what they were talking about, they built societies, or envisaged societies, where creativity was just a wonderful thing in itself, that they believed would actually be a much happier, more pleasant society. So I would just like to know what the panel's kind of thought about the potential intrinsic benefits of creativity.
Okay, I can see lots of hands still up. I'm going to just start with Martin, work down this way.
A couple of things then. I'll pick up the point on knowledge. I mean, absolutely, if you don't teach knowledge, if you don't teach the subject, I don't know what you are teaching. And it got to a point with personal learning of thinking skills and this, that and the other, when you couldn't have any space to teach the actual subjects. The subject gives you the discipline, gives you the training, gives you the thought processes, and the silo within which to become creative. But also you need to teach beyond the silos as well, and that takes to another point. And then I think it's something Scruton said, if I can remember it, the objects we look at and the art comes to us imbued with our way of knowing it. What art brings us, and teaching things as an art I'm talking about, not art per se, but teaching things as though it's an art, so that includes science. It becomes a way of describing what it is to be human, and that's the most important part of what we do in schools. We're investigating what it is to be human. Part of that is we create stuff as human beings, and creativity is an intrinsic part. Creativity in subjects, in beyond subjects, in new areas as well, is an intrinsic part of what it is to be human. And that is where our moral imagination, all these other things come into play. And if we don't teach knowledge, we don't get that. We're just pissing in the wind, really.
Okay, so let's move on to JJ.
Firstly, on the point of the class issue in arts education or working class students, I think, one level, the emphasis and prioritisation of art and design subjects when it comes to getting working class students into those subjects has been largely a very cynical and cowardly exercise in finding something for working class students to do. That is to say that the idea that there is no ambition and that maybe this is the kind of subject that suits working class students is the underlying kind of prejudice, and it's quite disgusting. I mean, the point there is that it suggests that there's no ambition for a certain socio-economic class of student, and that we shouldn't expect too much of them. I think that's from my experience, having taught in quite a lot of art colleges on a graduate level. You see increasingly this kind of rather degraded notion that this is what certain kinds of student can do. In fact, really, what we should be talking about is how to push and bolster ambition particularly for working class and underprivileged students, because that's what we should expect. We should want people to rise to that challenge. That actually comes to another concluding point, or another point from that, is that actually creativity, the arts, or any other subject actually is hard. Right? So there is a woolly, fluffy, rose-tinted thing where we think that it's self-realization is a happy process. Self-actualization and creativity is a happy thing. No, actually it's not. Right? Being creative often can be very painful, can be extremely hard work, and it is always about knowing what has happened before, because otherwise, if you don't know what has happened in your discipline, you are always in danger of simply repeating what has already happened.
Okay.
Don't worry, I'll keep it short. I think Martin covered a lot of what I was going to say. It's back to this knowledge versus application angle. I'm just constantly frustrated and flabbergasted by this black or white view. You know, you have to be one or you have to be the other. You have to be a massive fanboy of Ken Robinson's, or you have to hate the ground he walks on. I just don't get this polarisation. Ken Robinson says a lot of great stuff. Sugata Mitra says a lot of great stuff. They don't pretend to know everything. Nobody does. They're not that arrogant. They're actually a lot more humble than a lot of their biggest critics, and I think that's one of the biggest problems we have. You know, we have to mix it up and take a view.
Okay.
Onwards and upwards on that. I couldn't agree more. I was really taking the view from the speaker over here. It frustrates me that this issue of having to choose 3-4 A-level subjects still remains. That was an issue 40 years ago. I went through it, and we've never resolved that one. So that was one. And the second one is this working class voice, which has already been picked up on. I think the point of a lot of the frameworks being set up, the point of a lot of the work we do here at the Barbican and the Guildhall is to ensure every young person from every walk of life gets access to this and then can genuinely progress. Because, just as been said, it cannot be assumed just to be for one class or one social economic income level or whatever. That is where a lot of the creativity lies as well. And a lot of the greatest creative voices have come from very humble beginnings and have been major influences in our society and lives.
Well, I agree that it's a false opposition between creativity and knowledge. They both go hand in hand. They have to go hand in hand. You use the phrase to teach properly. I think if you're teaching properly, you're building that depth of knowledge, but you're also creating the conditions whereby creativity can happen. On the social justice point, I think that's key. I think we're seeing increasing inequality. It deeply concerns me. Our own work at the Crafts Council very much seeks to address that. I think you're seeing pockets where people aren't getting the chance to discover, do they have an aptitude for a particular musical instrument, let's say, or for a particular dance style, or for a particular material, glass blowing, metal smithing, what have you. And I think that's really, really worrying, because it's a waste of talent, it's a waste of potential, it's a waste of joy and discovery in something that might carry you through life, which brings me to the intrinsic value point, which is, you know, of course, this, I think that when the creative industries have made that economic case so hard, because that's what Treasury will listen to, but I think it's really undermined the case that actually the arts and creativity are of huge value in and of themselves and create joy throughout life.
I just want to pick up on a word that you mentioned, Annie, in your opening statement, the word collaboration. And I think that's really, really important, because as someone who studied a fine art degree but came straight from school, you're suddenly thrown into this world of self-direction, and creativity plays a massive part, but yet you've come from a place where it's rote learning and you sit an exam at the end of 2 years and you just reel it off. So, and I think for me, collaboration within my degree was a massive part of helping my creativity. So I'm just wondering, is it something that could be peer-to-peer learning at a younger age that could be brought into schools in a way of harnessing creativity across the board?
I was 11, I was good with my hands, so I was sent to a technical school. And I learned there that creativity was engendered in people because we were allowed to do things. And, you know, you hear the jokes about people going to do metalwork and woodworking, but actually they're really hard subjects. And what we got to do at the end of the year, when we did our, in fact, I did an engineering A-level, we were allowed to do things which you'd see in practitioners in the arts. And this is my point, it's not about the arts. Creativity is not an artistic subject solely. We were taught things like the reflective practitioner, Donald Shern. We were taught to look at ourselves as creatives and not just as students. And those things, I think, I see in my own children are not happening in the schools at the moment. And I think people who are teaching the being titled creative subjects are not giving, are being Uncle Tom about it and going along with the schemes they've been given and not in trying to ensure they have enough space for the children to actually learn to do the creative things that I was doing in the 70s that seem to have been taken away from them, just so that they can fit a marking scheme.
Some of you on the panel are kind of confused at why there's this massive dichotomy between knowledge and this creative stuff. And I'll tell you why there's this dichotomy, because you keep going on about unteaching. And what the hell are you talking about? You can't, once someone's been taught something, you cannot unteach that. They know it. You can't make them unknow it. But what you mean by that, I think, what you mean by that is that somehow there's something wrong with education, that we're doing it all wrong, that you need to kind of educate people in a different kind of way. And that's why there's this massive dichotomy. You want a very, it's basically romanticism. You think that, you know, children are just kind of these wonderful, pure beings, that education spoils them, and that's the problem.
I was brought up in the idea that children are having almost a conformity imposed on them, and we want to discourage that. It just occurred to me, I went to the Venice Biennale about 3 or 4 years ago, and what I noticed there was an awful lot of what was presented as art was basically collages about environmental issues and basically going on about how we're all messing up the planet. And to me, that seems almost like a new kind of conformity from creatives. So I don't know if we're all, just because you're creative, you're not conforming. You have your own conformities within yourself, possibly.
I think you can't teach it, but you can inspire it. As a member of Guildhall, in my piano lessons, my teacher teaches me the notes, but he then inspires me to play the melodies. Like, you can't be taught it, it's inspirational.
I think art and music should definitely be taught in school. I have huge suspicion of the idea of creativity in education. I think that it has generated a huge amount of confused thinking, which is actually reflected on this panel. So we have, on the one hand, yes, knowledge should be taught in schools. On the other hand, we should say they're talking about teaching knowledge through art. Well, art is a very particular area of knowledge, and that area of knowledge should be taught in and of itself. It shouldn't be confused with history or maths or anything like that. And I think the problem with this discussion about creative education, which has been going on now for a good 50 years, I think, is that actually it has created a hugely confused education sector, so people really don't know what they're doing anymore.
Play and creativity is a big factor now in businesses and commercial kind of organisations, because they're all obsessed about being playful, about bringing forward ideas. But of course, you know that's not really about being creative. That's about actually being very risk averse, about creating genuine kind of change and ideas. So we need to look at it in terms of how kind of creativity is being kind of used in a very broad cultural sense, where often it's not really about the sort of the kind of real knowledge of new thinking at all.
Full disclosure, I am a graphic designer. How useful is it to separate creativity from the objects which are being created, the creations? And the reason I'm asking that question is because it doesn't surprise me at all that there are so many graphic designers and so few industrial designers, when if you're a graphic designer, you don't really make anything at the end of the day. You can be an Adbusters, you can be a Banksy, brilliant. But if you're an industrial designer, you're producing material stuff, things that change the world. And that's very, you know, there's a lot of ambivalence about that these days. So there's I suppose unmoralizing the creations, is that something that we can unlearn?
Okay, we're going to have to go to closing remarks. Let's start with Annie and work this way.
Then I best to pick up on the unteaching point, because I obviously didn't make myself clear. I think that if you want to, I think within teaching and training, one can only create the conditions whereby creativity can flourish. And one of those conditions that's necessary but not sufficient is that there is subject knowledge. And that might be the subject knowledge within an arts discipline, or it might be the subject knowledge within a humanity or within a science, in which then creativity in arts, in science, or in humanities can then flourish. And we need both. We need both the knowledge and the facilitation of creative thought.
I just want to say one thing that I've really taken from this discussion is not to mix creativity too much with the arts. We are talking about creativity within schools and the role it can play in people's learning and development. The rest is to do with subject matters, which can all play into that area of creativity.
I think, like Annie, I don't like the word teach. As I said, for me, it's about nurturing creativity. It's around inspiring creativity. And we talked earlier, and the title is Can We Teach Creativity? It's about we inspiring creativity as a group. For all our futures, we have to do this.
I mean, I think whatever you call it, you're still teaching it. Nurturing, this or that, it's still teaching. You're being a teacher, you're making it happen, you're enabling something to happen. If that's teaching, that's teaching. I don't know. I think it is. The important thing is that most art, popular culture, mass culture, fine art culture, most of the products of those activities are rubbish. Okay? And they're rubbish because they simply repeat what has already been done. And that is a huge amount of... So it doesn't matter whether you think it's creative. It's a creative practice producing something that looks creative, that looks like art maybe, but it is mostly rubbish. You know, the Venice Biennale is a very good example of that. Within that, there may be something that is creative. Within that junk product, there may be at some point something which is creative. The gentleman that said that creativity is not an artistic subject is absolutely right. It's the other way around. Art is one of the subjects in which creativity happens. That's the point about that. And the important thing about creativity and knowledge as being polar opposites, that's, for me, it's partly to do with the fact that we obsess with the idea that the creativity is a form of self-actualization. Right? So it's indifferent to learning anything. It's just about being and doing your thing. Right? So real creativity actually is the hard bit. We can all play to learn the recorder at school, but there's that point you remember at school where someone really starts to work at it, and sooner and later they're at the conservatory, and it wasn't you. Knowledge and creativity go hand in hand. So that's really what I want to leave behind there.
Can I speak up for rote learning? I think it's, as a drama teacher, I think it's vital to learn your script. Sometimes, you know, it comes as a very important part of it, and you can collaborate as well around it, of course. But so rote learning, or learning by heart, there you go, a more empathetic way of seeing it. I went, when Creative Partnerships started, I went to Chicago to see a school teaching science through creativity. And it was talking about energy transfer, and they had 4 actors in the classroom. And what they were doing is asking the kids to push the actors. So they had to push the actor, and they were watching energy transfer. It was rubbish. It was awful. So you can teach things in this way, and it's going to suddenly... There's nothing worse than someone trying to be creative in a classroom and try and teach, and teach is the right word. Teaching is a wonderful word. And our demarcation on this, you know, we want to keep teachers. We don't want to be replaced by anything else. So we are teachers, we teach. We teach playfully as well. Part of the intellectual rigor of a classroom is playfully prodding away and getting kids to think in different ways. So playfulness is part of an intellectual, knowledge-based classroom, if you like. Making stuff is vital. It's the liberal arts that I think, so we talk arts all the time as a way of teaching everything. And lastly, is that all right? Lastly, if you're playing an instrument, recorder, or whatever, you are so disciplined, every note you have is told to you. Jacqueline Dupre playing the cello, the Elgar cello concerto, all the notes were already there. She had to obey that. So there's something else going on here, because why is hers the best? Why is hers the best? Because there's something about the necessity of having to do something, living within a discipline, living within that discipline and finding yourself within that, an absolute discipline and knowledge and having to do. And all those things come together in the greatest art.
Okay, I think we need to give a round of applause to all the speakers.